I was working with Ukrainian journalists who were assigned to cover the Supreme Council, and part of what I was doing with them is transparency issues, like how can we get politicians to be more transparent so that we can cover them better. But I always wondered, what is Ukraine outside of Kiev? So I'm really happy to be here in this UNESCO World Heritage City. I'd like to thank the Media Forum for inviting me here and the U.S. Embassy for helping to sponsor this very important meeting that comes at a critical time in Ukraine's history. I'm very, very serious about this. I want to say how proud I am to be here and how honored. I know that some of the best journalists in Ukraine are in this room with us. And I'm very honored to be part of this group. The world has been following what your journalists do. And a lot of the news that we know in the West comes from the local journalist in Ukraine. And I just wanted to say that not only are we following you, we are inspired by you and the very amazing work you have been doing under dangerous, dangerous circumstances. And I know I speak for other American journalists. We stand in solidarity with you as you move forward in these very difficult times. And when I say we stand in solidarity with you, I mean it. We watch Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, all these different groups are keeping an eye on what's happening in Ukraine. I have followed the events here since the beginning of Maidan. I watched the demonstrations, I watched the protest, and I am closely following what is happening in the eastern part of your country. In a recent article, the New York Times called what is happening here, and I am quoting directly from the New York Times, the worst violence on the continent since the conflicts in the Balkans in the 1990s, and the most dangerous dispute between the West and Russia since the Cold War. So that does involve us. Americans are involved, our interest is involved, Europe's interest is involved. And I wanted to tell you, top headline in CNN today said, Russia plans to do bombing flights near the US border. Now, guess why Russia's going to do bombing flights near the US border? The story reported it's because of America's ties to Ukraine. So I guess now Russia's punishing us too, because it's starting to say, well, you know, if you're going to do this with Ukraine, we're going to do that in the Caribbean and on your coast. I have worked in conflict zones around the world, from the Middle East and South Asia to South America and the Balkan regions of Europe. I covered the war. I covered the war in the Balkans, in Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Kosovo. And I saw, as an eyewitness, I saw what harm propaganda and hate language and lies fostered by a state-run government can do. Slobodan Milosevic was a master at propaganda. And I think we're seeing the same thing with your neighbor across the border, and I think you know who I am talking about. I can tell you one thing I have learned for certain from my experience. The media's role is never, never more important than during a time of conflict and crisis. There's no time journalists are more important to our societies than when our homelands are going through conflict and crisis. And high ethical standards are such a vital part of that. I'm listening today, obviously with the earphones for translation, I'm listening today to how many times your journalists on the panels brought up ethics. It's really at the core of everything journalists do. We don't have a lot of time because I have 30 minutes, so I'm going to go rather quickly. I'd like to do two things. I'd like to look at the role of media during times of conflict and look at the ethical values that come into play when we're covering crisis and conflict. And by the way, That includes the high-risk journalist take. I mean, your journalists have covered dangerous and unpredictable assignments during the demonstrations, and now they're on the front lines of a war going on the eastern side of your country. And then I'd like to look at the new media, because new media has affected everything we do these days. Now, professional journalists in this room, we have a responsibility to produce accurate, fair, and reliable information. Those are among the top watchwords of our profession: accuracy, fairness, and reliability. But new media doesn't have to do that. Anybody can publish anything about anything on the media, on the internet. And I think there's no better example of good journalism than what's happened here in your homeland. As I said, journalists watching you from the United States and other countries are inspired by you. As Ukrainians voted, and we'll see if this works from here, I don't know if it will. As Ukrainians voted in October, the world watched. And I love this photograph because it's an elderly villager voting. I know that young people want to see change in Ukraine, and I'm sure you voted and you're activist and you supported the movement. But it's wonderful to see an older person studying her voting, studying the ballot with her magnifying glass. So I found that picture, and by the way, that's very famous. That has run in the media all over the world as a representation of what happened here. And then what was playing out in the streets in Ukraine was leading the news in the United States and in Europe. CNN was here, New York Times, Washington Post, Reuters, BBC, Al Jazeera. You had dozens and dozens of international media in your country. I found a headline. A reporter from the New York Times was in Kiev recently, May 7th, and wrote a story, "Young Ukrainians brush aside the crisis and voice optimism about the future." It was a wonderful story about a young woman named Natalia, who founded an online television channel that broadcast the country's revolution. And the New York Times wrote about her and other young journalists in Ukraine. So the New York Times is definitely still here. Al Jazeera has written many stories about Ukraine's displaced people who are being forced out of the east and in those areas where the conflict is happening. And I think those are some great stories because they're stories about the innocent people of Ukraine who are suffering. And the media has done a very good job of giving voice to those voiceless people. Remember, news is only really important when we tell the reader how it affects ordinary people. That's when news is really important. And how the conflict in your country is affecting ordinary people is a great story right now because those people are suffering and they're totally innocent. I found a story just before I came here with the dateline of Lviv, of this city. And it was a really wonderful article about saying that this was the most determined city in the Ukraine to push their nation towards Europe and not to fall in line with the Soviet Union, even in the old days. So there was this wonderful article about this city and the history of this city and how it really never was quite as much in line, even during those days when the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union. It is true that international media have played a very major role in the coverage of this war and of this revolution. But let me say this, they are not the heroes. The heroes here are your local journalists, and they have been hailed as heroes around the country. When we talk about what's coming, the stories that are coming out of Ukraine, it's your local journalists, your local reporters, your local editors, your local station managers, who really are the ones who are doing the hard and dangerous work here. After Euromaidan, I had the good fortune to interview some Ukrainian journalists by email and by Skype. And my story was about their investigations into the corruption of your former regime. I don't need to tell you about that. You know very well how corrupt the former regime was. And during the time I was interviewing these journalists, I was just so amazed at their passion and their commitment and how hard they were working. And they all had faced danger in one way or another, either during the demonstrations or during their investigations. Many journalists in this room have paid a price for their courage and for their good journalism, because in times of crisis and conflict, journalists are among the first to be attacked. There's always someone who wants to silence the message and silence the messenger. I read a report just before I came here by OSCE. They said that nearly 300 cases have been reported against violence against Ukrainian journalists: murder, physical assault, kidnapping, threats, intimidation, imprisonment, and confiscation of equipment. Now, those are just the cases OSCE knows of. You better believe there are more. 300 is too many. No journalist should be punished for being courageous. No journalist should be published for doing their job. It's not hard to see why this is an important topic here today on conflict and the media. This slide, and I'm using PowerPoint because we're working in 2 languages, and I know it's hard. You're listening to my English, and I don't speak, unfortunately, Ukrainian. So I'm using the PowerPoint to help us. There is no doubt that media coverage here, both the local coverage and the international coverage, had a direct impact on what the world knew and what the world still knows. But here's the thing. News reports, when they're not good, when they are propaganda, can fan the flames of violence. Propaganda, hate language, can cause public fear and can cause public panic. And I think we're seeing that in some parts of your country now, due to the propaganda coming out from that country on the other side of the border. This is the downside of the media's impact during crisis. Here's the upside on this slide. It creates well-informed analysis of the conflict. When we do our job right, it helps the public understand what is the conflict, why, how is it happening, who are the main players. It expands the range of story angles and story ideas. I know there are journalists in this room who could explain this better than me, because they've been on the front lines here. But journalists can expand the story angles just from this side attacks this side, attacks this side, attacks an airport. That's important coverage, but more important coverage are the human consequences of violence. Look at my third one on there. If you remember anything from me today, that's it. We have to report the human consequences of violence, and that goes back to voice of the voiceless. And we have to avoid personal agendas, which is hard to do sometimes. At our very best, we can have a positive effect on our readers, and we can also have a calming effect, especially when people are being threatened, as they are in Ukraine. Journalists, our role is not to be peacemakers. Nobody says journalists should be peacemakers. That's not part of our mission. But I can tell you this, and it's very important. When we do our job right, we can help move closer to solutions by the kind of reporting we do, when it is fair, when it is accurate, and when we tell the truth. Now, there's one thing I want to make clear. I'm not suggesting that the journalists in this room or in this country take a stance of moral equivalency. During the Balkan War, people used to report everybody is equally to blame, ancient hatreds. No, not everyone is equally to blame for what's happening in the eastern part of your country. So I am not suggesting that we put the aggressor and the victim on the same footing. What I am suggesting is that our reporting, no matter how passionate we are, remains truth-telling, accurate, and fair, and responsible. That is a very thin line between advocacy and crusading. I mean, advocacy is different than journalism, and journalists often play the role of crusader when maybe that puts us over the line. We base our reporting on facts if we are good at what we do and if we are ethical about what we do. Here's what I would suggest. What is going on in the eastern part of your country, look at the Geneva Convention on War Crimes. Call it up and look at it. Google it and read it, and you will see that some of your reporting could reflect that there are probably war crimes going on in that part of your country. I'm talking about injuring and killing civilians, destroying churches, hospitals, and schools. Destruction of private property falls in the category of war crimes. You can inform your reporting and make your reporting stronger when you know human rights law. And you know what? We don't have to be lawyers. We can go on to the internet and we can read about human rights law and make that part of our reporting about what is going on, the conflict that's going on in your country. Now, that sounds easier said than done because truth, as has been said many times, is the first casualty of war. Truth is the first casualty of war. But we can help that not be true by doing our job. And I highly suggest, I used to teach a whole course on humanitarian law and the media. I am not a lawyer, but by doing my research, I could come up with the laws that were being violated in countries, armies, invading armies, armies inside countries around the world. You can do that kind of reporting here. I just read a report from the United Nations Commissioner on Refugees, and Ukraine has a worsening refugee or displaced persons problem than most of the world. I think Jordan, because of Syria, may be worse. But you have over 150,000, maybe even 200,000 people on the run here. That is a huge human story, a huge human story. And those people are voiceless until the media gives them a voice. A lot of propaganda and a lot of conspiracy theories, we can use our media here to refute that. Not to one-up them, like your propaganda is terrible, so I'll do worse propaganda. Not that, because that's really not ethical or good journalism. But you can look at the hate language, you can look at the misconceptions, and you can report on that, legitimately report on that. Identifying underlying interest, provide emotional outlet for the public. That is huge. That is huge. I've only been here since yesterday afternoon, but even in the hotel, if I asked the waiter at dinner last night, everybody's worried about this conflict. Everybody's worried, how much further is it going to spread? Can it be stopped? This is on the minds of all Ukrainians. The media can provide emotional outlet for the public. You can tell those stories that help the public understand and help the public at least have sympathy, for some of those people who are running from that area. Framing the conflict is important. Don't let the other side be the only. I call this the global language of journalist. I'm a media specialist trainer, and I work particularly in developing countries, and I've been working in the Middle East. I just got back from Pakistan last week. And here's what I can tell you from my own experience. This is the international language of journalists. If I am in Islamabad or Karachi, and I say, what are the journalism values? This is what I get. If I'm in Yemen, if I'm in Cairo, if I'm in Kiev, if I'm in Lviv, this is what I'm going to get. The journalists in this room know this, but the planners for the Media Forum told me that the whole audience would not be journalists. So I thought, okay, maybe I better explain it a little bit. At Indiana University, I taught the ethics course in the journalism school, and I have conducted dozens of workshops around the world on ethics. And I can tell you that this is the global language of journalists. Seeking truth, I'm going to go through this very quickly because I know we're pressed for time. Seeking truth and reporting it for fact-based journalists. Testing accuracy of information from all sources. Accuracy is everything. Accuracy is everything. If we are not accurate, our public learns not to trust us, and we lose credibility and reliability, and when we lose that, we lose a lot. seek out subjects of the news stories and give them a fair chance to respond, so we don't just do a one-sided story. I know sometimes we have to, particularly if we're in a conflict zone. Sometimes we always don't need to get to the other side if we know who the aggressors are. But at the same time, it's something to strive for if we can. Always question motives of sources before promising that you won't use their names. Don't fall into that trap of using anonymous sources. Acting independently, avoid conflicts of interest. I think that's very important for this audience. Somebody in the room told me today, some of the good journalists in this room, and I think I see a couple of them, are going into politics. Now, in the United States, I have to tell you, you cannot be a politician and a journalist at the same time. You're one or you're the other. And if you become a politician, it's very hard for you to leave that and come back to being a journalist, because your name forever will be associated with that political party or that political movement. So avoid conflicts of interest. Now, it's different here in Ukraine, and I'm very anxious to hear more talk about this and how journalists are making this move. Be wary of sources offering information for money or for favors. Advertisers, I think we know that. This one's really important, to be accountable to our audience and encourage the public when they're angry at us. We need to hear why they're angry. We can do that now on the internet. We can do comments so we can hear from our public. What are you doing in the media in Ukraine that ticks everybody off and that they're upset about? Let's hear that so we can decide how to change it. And expose unethical practices when they occur. So if you do have an unethical issue, that you would immediately say, look, we didn't mean for this to happen, but it did, and we explain it. Minimizing harm, showing compassion for those caught up in the news. You have around 200,000 people on the run here. When you're interviewing them, they're witnesses to the violence. They're survivors of the violence, and you have to respect them and treat them with great dignity because they've already suffered so much. I'm going to go to, because I know we're going to run out of time. Here's what serious journalists never, ever, ever do. We never use language that promotes conspiracy theories, rumors, or propaganda. We never, ever do that. And if somebody else is doing it, we can write and report about how they are doing it and why they are doing it. We never publish photos or videos that distort reality. We never repeat what has been reported without checking. You pull something off the internet, you put it in your story, or you put it on your Facebook, or you put it in your blog. If it's wrong, guess who's to blame? Not the person who wrote it, you, because you took it from the internet and you used it and you didn't check it out. Never trust anything on the internet. Never trust anything on the internet unless you know for sure who wrote it and that is someone you trust. The ultimate test, 3 questions. Have I obtained information in an ethical way? Have I done everything I can to check facts, even off the internet? And can I stand by my story? Would I be proud to read it to my mother or my father? I mean, that's the ultimate test for me. Would I like to show it to be proud to show it to my family? Decision making. We do whole workshops on decision making, and I'm going to spend about 20 seconds on it. But here's a simple little formula. What is my journalistic mission? If I don't know what my journalistic mission is, why am I doing the story? What alternatives do I have? What are the consequences? How can I defend running the story or photos? And how would I feel if it was me? That doesn't mean you don't run it. It just means you're more sensitive to it. How are we doing for time? Are we okay? 10 minutes? Oh, I'll be done before that. Journalism has evolved now into what I call mixed media. We have a mixture now of traditional journalism combined with new media. When I was growing up, these young faces, when I was your age, we did not have that. We had traditional media. Today's much more complicated because we have mixed media. We've mixed the new media, we've mixed traditional media. And that makes it a lot more difficult for you here in Ukraine and for me in the United States, wherever we practice journalism. What are the challenges that we face? The challenge is the digital age. Do the same ethical values apply to new media When you post something on Facebook or Twitter, or you post a blog, should you keep those same 4 values? The truth-telling and the independence and all of those good things? Do the same ethical guidelines apply? And opportunities and challenges. You know, the media today, social media today has opened up doors for us we couldn't even imagine 5 or 7 years ago, 10 years ago. But here's the pitfall and the challenge. It also opens us up to rumor, conspiracy theory, and lies. I want to give you a quick example from the United States. The Washington Post is one of the best newspapers in my country, along with the New York Times. During the Iraq War, which was not a popular war with Americans, our President George Bush liked it, and his vice president liked it, others liked it, but the American people were not sold on this war. So my husband and I, who you're going to hear from tomorrow, photojournalists, we open up the newspaper one day while we're drinking our coffee, and we see a story on the front page about a soldier named Jessica Lynch, a female combat soldier, who was attacked with her group, with her comrades, was attacked by the Iraqi army. She fought to the death. She fought until her gun had no more bullets left. She was wounded. She was taken prisoner and put in an Iraqi field hospital. She was raped. She was beaten. She was tortured. It was just terrible. Blonde, blue-eyed, all-American girl. We sent in, the United States government sent in special forces to liberate her from the hospital, to rescue her. And when she came out, guess what? None of that was true. Not only did the Washington Post use it, but New York Times picked it up, CNN picked it up, and all of America was in love with this blonde, blue-eyed girl who was fighting these mean Iraqis to the death. When she was able to talk, she said, oh no. She said, actually, our vehicle overturned. I never fired a shot. My gun, in fact, had jammed. They never beat me. They treated me very well and gave me good medical treatment because she had some serious injuries from the accident. There were no rapes. So here you have American journalists who preach all this stuff to each other, and when it came down to it, what was the Pentagon trying to do? The Pentagon was trying to sell the war. They were trying to spin the war and give us a hero and help the American people get angry at the Iraqis and think, well, gee, maybe we should be there. None of it was true, and that's something that we preach. This is a case study I use over and over, because guess what? The story was based on anonymous sources. Never, ever, ever base a story on anonymous sources. Sources close to the Bush administration, sources close to the Pentagon, sources close to everybody. And it simply was not true. So I tell you that as a cautionary tale because it can happen anywhere, no matter how careful we are. You can Google it, Jessica Lynch, believe me, you'll pull it up. And I just want to wind up with the advantages. We can talk about all these disadvantages. Competition is fiercer than it's ever been. It's wonderful because our archives, when I knew I was coming here, I start looking back at Ukraine history because I wanted to know. This is a very fascinating country, and you've been through a lot historically, and I wanted to know. And it was so easy for me to find, click of a finger. And then it invites the audience interaction, which may be the most important. Our audience has never been able to talk to us this way before, and now they can. These are the challenges, and I will end with this. We have to verify information, and because we're moving so fast, 24/7, no stops on our deadlines, we don't verify information, which means we get a lot of bad information out there. Diminished quality control. Even as many good editors as I know are in this room, these editors will tell you, diminished quality control. Their staffs are smaller, doing more, each journalist is doing more, staffs are smaller, and the internet is pushing with competition. Every editor knows that. And unjustified credibility to bloggers. Just because somebody is a blogger doesn't mean that he or she has any credibility or any expertise. We see a blog and we pull from it and we quote from it. I want to know who the blogger is. So I think sometimes we give these bloggers way too much credit. I think you really need to do your homework and figure out who they are if you're going to use their material. And then speed causes mistakes. I mean, that's the horrible part of it. So those are some of the downsides of it, but the upsides are much more, much more. Thank you very much for listening. I know we're going to have a panel now, and you can find my email easily, and I would be happy to work with any of you. Some of you are working on stories that I can either help you or get somebody to help you, particularly if it's about ethics and conflict. And I do have, but I don't know if I can get it, my email. There it is. There's my email up there, if you can see it. Rikia. And because, listen, I bet there are 15 journalists today online talking to me from Pakistan because I was just there. So I'm very happy to do that for you. Thank you very much, and good luck. I'm going to be watching you.